All right, so we're back, and what we've done up to this point is we created our API right here that's using this thing called fetch. Fetch is making AJAX request that's happening in the background to these particular URLs, getting a response back, turning it into JSON, and then feeding it back to our front end. We passed all of our tests. Our server is still running at this particular point, and now we're going to start integrating it into our particular application. But before we do anything, I want to talk about a fancy concept. Not a fancy concept. It sounds fancy, and you can impress people with your technical lingo, but it's called a component lifecycle. I'm going to show you this particular image. So there are 8 component lifecycle methods that you have. So each component, you can think of it as a living being. Like when think of a human being. So when I think of like life cycle, think about as a human being. You're born as a newborn, right? And then you as parents you're in baby jail because the newborn needs you all the time. Then they become toddlers. Then they have there's another life cycle. They become like kindergartners and grade school people. And then they enter teenage years, which is the worst time in the world. But there are different cycles to your life. Then you become college age, early 20s, young families, parents, like parents to teenagers, retirees, and then grandparents. Like there's different cycles that you as in your life are going to go through. Similarly, there's different cycles that each React component is going to go through. And it starts here at the 12 o'clock round and goes all the way into this will unmount. So basically, these provide you different hooks. Before any of these things will happen, you can hook into that particular thing. So at the top, this is when a component is first born onto the DOM of your browser. So it basically says component will mount. So before the component will mount onto the screen, you can do some sort of calculations. The main ones you're going to use are component will mount, did mount, will receive props, and then render. So you all are familiar with render. Once the component renders onto the screen, it does a bunch of things. Every single time the component updates, you can hook in at that point. And then once the component unmounts or dies, you also have the ability to hook in at that particular point. So we're going to talk about component will mount, did mount, and we already know render. Just know the main thing about component life cycles for right now, and I'll put up some more notes because this is a lot faster than I wanted it to be. You're able to hook into a component at different points. Similarly, remember in when we were doing controller actions, it was before save or after, before action, find the user, before action, find all the events or something like that. Before you do anything, before you do a particular action, you want to do something else. Similarly here, it's a very similar thing. Once the component will mount onto the screen, I want you to do something. Before the component did mount onto the screen, or after the component did mount onto the screen, I want you to do something. You can hook in at different component life cycles. So I'll keep this up for right now, and let's continue pushing forward. So at the moment, there are 2 components that that will utilize the news. So if you take a look inside of my source, I have my pages. I have 2 pages that are going to use the news. I have homepage. You can see it imports news from news.json, and the article page, it imports news from news.json. For the home page, we're grabbing all the news and we're passing it down into the article list. And in the article page, I'm calling out to the news.json array and finding a particular index. And I want to refactor this so I'm no longer using static things. In React, you typically fire off API calls to using the component did mount. So it looks a little something like this. Let's say we have some sort of component. We have a constructor and we have a render. Constructor, again, is like the initialize of Rails app. It takes in some properties, gives you some state, and then the render is what gets shown out to the screen. By having this component did mount, these are protected methods, basically saying once the component did mount onto the screen, I'm going to call the API. Once I get the API, I'm going to get some sort of response, and I'm going to set the state. using this same thing, I'm going to try to run it inside of homepage right here. So maybe I will do, I want to follow this pattern that I did over here. I'm going to split the screen into two real quick. I want to follow this particular pattern and throw it inside of homepage. So using, actually, Danny, why don't you re-explain to me this component did mount of what's happening on this particular page?
The component did mount?
Or just read from top to bottom and explain this whole thing to me.
So you're the constructor that's inheriting
props.
Right, but it's, I forgot exactly why you need them here. Well, you're okay because you're inheriting the properties from the React.component. You're setting the state with the object to some data from an API till null. So you try to manipulate that later. And then you have method component did mount. And you're changing the state of your some data from an API, but I'm not sure what you're doing before that.
Cool. And then what about the bottom here?
You just put your rendering out to the screen after your return.
Yep. Yeah, so basically I have this component, and right when the component's born, it has nothing inside of some data from an API. It needs some sort of data, but there's nothing there. Once the component did mount onto the screen, so once this thing mounts onto the DOM, I'm going to call the API and get a response. Then once I get that response, I'm going to, because I started off with nothing, I'm going to override it with whatever that response is. And then at that point, you can kind of see, remember, component did mount onto the screen is a lifecycle component that happens before render. So this happens first, and then all of these other things can happen, and then render is hit onto the screen. So it's basically, you can think of this as like, I initialize a class with nothing. Before the render shows up on the screen, like before the view comes up on the screen, I'm going to make an API call inside this component did mount. With that, I'm going to start with this. So I'm going to more or less copy and paste constructor props. I am lazy, so I'm going to grab all this. I'm going to super the props, and I won't call this some data from an API. I'll just call this news articles equals nothing. Start off the news. We don't have this at all. I'm going to get rid of this. I know I'm going to get rid of this. Is going to be this.state.news articles. So the component's born. It's the will mount at this point. It renders everything out. It creates my initial state. And I'm just going to grab all of this code for the component did mount portion. So obviously, I don't have call API as a class here. I have my articles API class. So I'm going to pull this to the side. I can find where to go. I'll pull this to the side right over here. I want to import this, all of this stuff inside of here. I probably realistically only need one thing. How do I bring in all of these articles API inside of here?
You're going to import it at the top of the page.
All right, I like that. I am going to import articles API from, let's see. So I'm here. I need to go out one level to get to pages, go to API, and then articles API. So out one layer, into the API folder, and then articles API.js. I've got this thing here, so I'm not going to do call API. I will change this. I'll do articles API dot fetch articles for all of them, and then I get my response, and I'm going to set the state for news articles to API response JSON. At that particular point, I can just load up all the article lists, and I think we should be good. So let's take a look at homepage. I got rid of news.json, and I instead moved, I'm using the articles API to call out to it using this component did mount lifecycle method. If all goes well, I can refresh this page, and absolutely nothing shows up.
It's the, I think the image. It's because I know later on that the JSON file or the API object is different from the original as far as grabbing the image of the byline.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if we're that far yet.
Okay, we're almost there.
Okay.
So basically what's happening here is when I refresh this page, the article API is running asynchronously, and it's not setting the state fast enough to keep up with the render. We basically need to check if this.state.articles exists before we can pass it down. I think we're okay with this one. Let's jump down into article list. I think we're okay here in the article. Let's go back over here and read if there's any sort of errors inside of this. Elements, console. All right, it looks like something blows up here. Uncaught type error. This is where it blows up. Article list line 6 cannot read property map of null. So let's go to article list line 6. We can't map over this.props.articles, which means that over here, this.state.newsarticles is probably not defined. I think that's what the issue is. Let's take a look. Let's console log this.state. And so it's going to refresh, get a bunch of warnings, and there's my news articles. As of right now, it's nothing. So I'm making a request to the fetch articles API. I'm getting a response in JSON, and then I'm setting the state. But it's setting asynchronously. It's not fast. Like the render comes up before this is happening. So why don't we do this? Let's do console log this.state here, and we can console log this.state at the end. So it loads. I should have two things. Oh, it's blowing up even before that. Huh. That makes a difference. Okay. So we start off with nothing, and we end up with nothing? That's strange.
How's it running?
What's that?
How's it loading all the articles?
I don't know. I think it's like, I think the async is the API request is happening fast enough to the point where it's not reading this.state. Let's do this. Let's console log API response JSON. Let's see what we get back. Make sure that we can even get something back from the server. We'll start with that. So once the component mounts onto the screen, there it is. We have an array of 40 things. All right, so we know that the API is working because we made a request using the articles API, and we got back that we're console logging that out to the screen. Then we're setting it here, and it's not upon the set. I understand what's going on. Okay. So upon the first time, I get what's happening. Okay, so when you load the page, news articles is saved inside of state as nothing. We're all good on that, right? Before the render comes out onto the screen, it resets the state of news article from an empty array to the response, and we console logged it. We know we're getting back that response. Once you reset the state, it re-renders the whole page. So this whole section down here is now has access to this.state.newsarticles.
I think I have a solution. I don't know if it's the optimal.
Sure, let's try it.
In the state where the constructor is,
Mm-hmm.
I added another state, just loading, one that says loading as a key, and I have it default to it's true. And then in the component did mount, I'll make loading false. I'll set the state in there also with the news articles, so loading false, and then I'll put a condition in the render saying that if loading is true, then just have a div that says loading, else render the page.
Like that, something like that.
Something like that,
Yeah. Okay.
And then else would be you would actually render the rest of it, or that what you have.
Yeah, we could just do let output equal whole bunch of stuff. If I see where you're going with that. I like it. That one works. I'm going to take my quick win because this one does work. So I'm just going to keep it as is for now.
Okay.
So I'm still able to get all of these things. If I click this, it's still making a request to API. It's not making a request to API right now. So we got all of the things loaded on the home page. Now we need to get rid of it over here.
Yeah, quick question.
Sure.
Would you be able to just go ahead and throw the if you go back to that previous tab? Yeah, can you just put the article API that fetch articles in the state properties or in the state like so news articles,
Yes.
articles?
The answer to your question is yes. But generally speaking, the best practices that they agree on is when you're making an API request before the page loads, put it inside of a lifecycle component method called component did mount. So answer is yes, I could just totally grab all this and just shove it inside of here. Basically, that, put it in right over here instead. But they, just like best practices, they want to put it in a separate method so you're not doing all the calculations all at one time.
Well, you can would that alleviate the rendering issue?
The rendering issue is no longer an issue. It was because I had this as null to begin with. That was the only thing that was different. All right, so we fixed up the home page. Let's fix up the article page. Before we had this news JSON, and we're just kind of like reading it from here, and I don't really need that anymore. So maybe we can, the article page we also need to fix up. So let's jump over to that, see what we've got. So maybe right now we can just say the article is equal to just an empty object. And then similarly again, we can do component did mount. Once the component loads onto the screen, I'm going to use the article API, fetch article by ID using whatever's inside of the URL. So you'll notice like when I click on this, it'll take me to /1 for right now. Okay, this is broken. It says articles API is not defined. Makes sense. Import articles API from, I think I have to go out one level, API, articles API. Yes. I'm here on the home page. It makes a request to all of them, and I get all of them from the API. I'm not reading from a file anymore. Then when I click on one individual one, nothing is showing up, so we'll fix that. But the idea behind this is I'm going to make a request based off of the number that's inside of the URL right over here. And then using that response, I'm going to shove it out like this on this article. So we're having some issues here. Nothing's showing up on the screen. So my first question is, is it supposed to be fixed on this particular page, or is this like what should we do to debug this? I suppose is the main question.
Console log.
Console log what?
Or I mean, check the console in the browser.
Yeah.
See if there's any errors.
Yeah, we'll first take a look. Are there any browser, any console things? Okay, so it says cannot read property 0 of undefined. So this goes back to that image thing that we were talking a little bit about. So it's not, the issue doesn't live here on article page, it lives on article itself. So remember we had, where's that image thing? This props.image. If the image is there, then I'm going to return the image out to the screen. Article page is looking for this.state.article.multimedia 0. Maybe let's take a look at what the data that we get back is. So before I set this state, I'm going to console log the API response JSON, and we can see what we're getting back from the browser, from the API. Where did it go? Now read property 0 of undefined. So I'm not getting to this point. Let's just say, just make this hello. Re-render, there it is. So I have an error that says unknown issue. Okay, so even before then, I'm just going to console log this.props.match.article ID. I just want to make sure I have the right one. All right, so it says undefined. Undefined is no good. Any thoughts?
I think at some point I had to use that loading syntax. I don't know if you want to use it. So.
So get localhost API article is undefined. So the issue with what I'm getting is this.props.match.params.article ID does not exist. So let's just console log this.props.match.params. Let's just take a look at what params includes. Maybe this is incorrect. So this will refresh automatically, and let's see what we get. So we have article. God, are you kidding me? So we're missing a capital D. And since we're there, let's that was our main issue a little bit earlier. So console log API response JSON. We're going to console log API response JSON. We're going to turn this back into I for now. Page. All right. So when you take a look inside of this, is the API response that we get back. It's a giant JSON object. And if you take a look inside of here, before we had multimedia, and now they decided to change it back to image. So all I got to do is just change this from, so before what it was, let's go back to where it was broken. You can kind of see we were looking for this.state.article.multimedia 0, and instead they changed it. So we're just going to change this back to image, back to the correct ID, and let's see it happen. All right, so we have this thing broken again. Get API articles undefined. I think we're good. I don't know. Let's see what the issue is. Refresh the page. There it is. Let me go back to my home. Click on this one, everything still works. All right, the last little bit of today, before we finish out, is I want to click on one of these things, and based off of that, it will take me to that particular, like when I click on opinion, right now it's just console logging opinion inside the console. Instead, when I click on it, I want it to take me to a page that has all of the opinions on it. Is that part of today's thing? Or is that tomorrow's? Let me double check before I reach down the wrong path. Nope, that's tomorrow. I'm sorry. So today was basically like, we're going to create the API, which we did. We're going to write all of the functions that we need to do to make fetch requests to a particular URL. Using that data, instead of using static data, which was like import news from news.json, I'm going to use the component lifecycle method called component did mount to make a request before everything loads, reset the state, and using that, it'll execute out to the page. Any questions on anything?
Yeah. So with the component did mount, etc., those are available for every component.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you take a look here, like these are all the component lifecycle methods. So similarly, like how everyone goes through different phases in life based on like how old you are and what stage of life you're in, a component goes through something similar. It starts here at will unmount at 12 o'clock and it dies at will unmount at 10 o'clock. So this, like basically we know the render. The render is what shows up on the screen, but there's a whole bunch of different areas that you can hook into before the render is ever hit. So if you're making an API request, you're going to use component did mount onto the page. If you wanted to do something like whenever something updates, it would be component should update or component will update.